I am joined this morning by phone by the president of Take Back Action, and it is I'll let him describe what Take Back Action is. It's a part of Take Back Our Republic. John Pudner. Good morning, John. How are you?
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So let's talk about your organization and what you're all about and how you're going to help fix America for us, please.
Well, I think in 2015, we became the one conservative group focused on the rules of elections. I'd run Republican takeovers in 3 states. The state legislatures had just come off a big upset of Eric Cantor, who was the majority leader, was the first one to beat a majority leader. We thought it had gotten a little liberal despite being a Republican. But I just realized there were so many liberal groups working on changing the rules of elections, and there's just no one on the right engaged in that debate. So that's our focus, is rules of elections and how we can make sure it actually takes a majority to elect a Democrat, not let them keep getting elected with 49% of the vote because they've got to play with the rules.
Well, I'm glad that you bring that up about elections, because what caught my attention in particular last week about your organization is this Final Five. I don't know what you'd call it. Final Five.
Yep.
What's the? Well, let's start by talking about Final Five, because initially my reaction was, in the back of my mind as I'm reading about this, I'm thinking about Alaska and how Sarah Palin did not prevail, and it had, I don't know if it was Final Five or if it was another another type of way to decide elections that wasn't at least helpful for a Republican candidate.
Sure, and there are some similarities. I think there were some mistakes made in Alaska, but the states I'm focusing on is the way the current system is rigged. I mean, if you're going to replace a system, just like if you're going to replace an elected official, you have to decide the incumbent is bad. And my issue is we've got 7 states that have elected either Biden electors or a U.S. senator in the last few years with less than 50%. Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Minnesota, Nevada, West Virginia, and obviously Wisconsin. And the way the Democrats have done it is they have a great 1-2 punch in the current system. First, they spend money on picking the Republican that their polling shows is more vulnerable. And then in the second half, they push votes toward a conservative candidate. Look at Trump in Wisconsin in 2020. You had 50,000 votes either for the Libertarian, the Pro-Life Solidarity Party, or the Constitution Party. Not many of those 50,000 are going to then pick Biden over Trump if you have an instant runoff at the end of the process, which is a process we got through in Georgia for military overseas and a lot of southern states. And so that's the system we have to stop now. We can't keep having the governor of Illinois, Pritzker, spend $24 million to elect in the Republican primary to elect the opponent that his polling shows he can beat easily, which he did. And whatever people think on Dan Kelly, and I wasn't critical of Kelly at all during the race, but the Democrats polled saw he was much easier to beat, and they put $1 million into knocking Darrow down. So whether or not you agree or think they're right, or think Darrow would have been better or not, the fact is they're messing up our current system. And the key component of Final Five is at the end of the process to have people be able to an instant runoff like we got through in Georgia as part of the election reform, to have people then say, okay, now who do you really want? Now that you've cast your protest vote for the pro-life candidate, Constitution Party candidate, et cetera, who do you want, so that we don't keep having Democrats have a 49% threshold to win a state.
So let's talk, because I want to wrap my mind around how Final Five works, and then in turn our listeners, I hope, will be able to follow along as well. But so let's, as an example, or if we could, and if this doesn't work, you feel free to make up your own example. But if we could, let's look at the Wisconsin primary for the state Supreme Court. Can we apply the Final Five in that case?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. So if you can describe how it works so that we can grasp, obviously there were 2 conservative candidates and 2 candidates on the left that were running in the primary. And how would Final Five help to have aided Wisconsin in winning the general.
Sure. And I'll wrap last year's governor's race in, too.
Thank you.
So in both cases, you would have had the extra conservative advance. So Rebecca Clayfish would be on the final ballot, just as Dara would have been. And the first advantage to that is conservatives keep turning out. Obviously, there were people who really wanted Clayfish who didn't like certain outside ads that were ran and didn't show off or took a pass in the governor's race. I'm sure there's probably some of the same this year. So you still have the candidates on the ballot because the party, can pick a candidate however they want. Yeah, they could keep a primary, convention endorse, whatever. But in the end, the 5 candidates on the ballot are the 5 top vote getters in a playoff election, basically. That's a traditional election. It's just to see if you're viable or not. Can you place in the top 5? Obviously, Darrow does, Rebecca does, Tim Rantham does, last year. He'd be one of the top 5. So you get to the 5, and that's the place where you have an instant runoff, like we got set up in Georgia for military as part of the big election reform, et cetera, and most southern states have some kind of runoff. So you aren't dividing the conservative vote. You're letting every conservative continue to get people out, even if Rebecca lost by a couple of points in her primary. Tim Michaels could have the R by his name, be the Republican, but Rebecca's still on the ballot. And that works as long as you let people in say, okay, my first choice is Michaels, but if it comes down to Rebecca as one of the final 2, my vote's with her, and vice versa, I'm for Rebecca. So that's what Final 5 does. It gets you down to 5. And I guess my question is, I like Joan Bellinger as an independent. Why should she be on the final ballot, though? Because she got a couple thousand signatures. And then Rebecca Clayfish, who had 10 times the votes she did in a primary, not be on the final ballot. And that's what I believe Final 5 would solve. And by getting them out and not letting the Democrats, and I shouldn't just say Democrats, I should say outside billionaires spend this targeted money to peel off a few percent of conservatives to another candidate, it doesn't matter if that same voter still gets a second choice and says, no, I don't want Joe Biden or I don't want a liberal Supreme Court. So,
and forgive me, maybe I'm just slowly trying to grasp this. So when we're talking about Final 5, we're actually talking about as it applies to the general election, correct? So let's go back to the gubernatorial race. We're talking about the general election. So, I mean, in the ideal world, or in the ideal world of the Final 5, it would have been Tim Michaels, Tony Evers, Rebecca Clayfish, and Tim Rantham on the ballot.
And Joan Bellinger. I mean, I think she would probably be in the 5th, would be my guess.
All right. Okay. And so then how does that beat the Democrat if there are, 4 preferred non-Tony Evers candidates on the ballot?
Sure, because the key to Final 5 is you then do take your second choice. So you say, I'm for Rantham. He's the reform candidate. That's who I want. But you also get to choose how your vote would transfer. And this was part of, the big Georgia election reform bill that passed that the Democrats screamed about instead of suppressing votes and everything else. This was a component of that because the votes we were worried about suppressing was military overseas and letting them have transferable votes in the election. So it's a matter of where do you want your vote transferring if your first choice doesn't get to 50%, but neither does your opponent.
So is this kind of a fail-safe for bitter primaries? Is that the objective?
I'd say to some degree it is, but it's because the liberals have gotten so good at playing in the Republican primaries, when they're taking over the Republican primaries. If that weren't the case, and this started with Obama, and not to get too far in the weeds for your listeners, but when they started this analysis of people's psyche and where can you find that 3% that you can disgruntle and make go for another candidate. So you're not spoiling any votes. As you're saying, that 9% was the stubborn part that said, I'm not voting for anyone unless it's my first choice. Yeah, you lose that vote either way.
Okay. So what's the likelihood that something like Final 5 would actually be a reality in Wisconsin?
I think it takes a couple of years. This passed in Nevada, but that's more of a ballot state where it's on the ballot. And interestingly, it passed this past year, so it's passed again, it's constitutional. on the same day that the Democrat governor was taken out. There were 28 governors ran for election. The only one who lost was Nevada last year. And so this is a couple-year plan. I don't think, there's any chance that something's going to run through this year. But I think last week was just another example of, guys, the other side still playing in the primaries. You've got to look at this option, this idea that you're going to keep running primaries the same way, come out with a bitter, injured candidate, and then sulking supporters of another candidate every time you have one of these 2 or 3 point losses. So just hoping it'll be more and more accepted. And, this is a couple-year project, though.
Well, you seem optimistic, and that is heartening to me because it's frustrating. I'm an impatient person. I'll just say that, and it's kind of like well, if this is going to work, if this is really what we need to at least solve some of the bitter primaries fallout, then let's get it done. Is this something that our state legislature would have to take up?
They would. There are provisions for the legislature putting something on the ballot here, but really, Wisconsin's not a state that you normally pass laws through initiative and referendum. It would be the term in other states. So, the legislature would have to decide to move forward with this.
Do you feel like is this something that your organization would, dare I say, I'll use a different term, advocate for with our legislators, our Republican legislators?
We do, and we actually are registered to lobby, so no sensitivity there. Mainly we do it by going out and speaking. I mean, I'm speaking at a couple Lincoln Day dinners for different counties and things. So, we want to get the people behind this out there. The legislators are supposed to reflect the will of the people, and we're winning more support. There's some skepticism, until you explain it, and appreciate the opportunity to do that here. But we want the people back home to be for this, so that legislatures feel comfortable passing it in the next couple of years.
So I'm kind of curious because this was part of an email that I received about Final Five last week, and there's numbers comparing the Green Bay mayoral race with the numbers of the state Supreme Court race. Can you talk a little bit about that and how, how we could potentially have had a Republican mayor in Green Bay if perhaps we would have had the Final Five in place?
Yes, well, it could be. I think the bigger thing in the mayor's race was just, again, not to pick on Dan Kelly, but he wasn't as strong a candidate electorally. And great judge. I mean, so I don't want to all sound negative. But we oversaw about 18,000 door knocks in Green Bay, and we were seeing some separation. So people were getting to support, the Republican unofficial mayoral candidate, Chad, who you mentioned. But I kept saying, we're going to run 10 points out of the Supreme Court justice in Green Bay. So we had to have a Supreme Court candidate run within 10 points to win. It's just hard to get people to split their ticket that much with all of the sample ballots the other side does. So I think the difference there was just a nominee who wasn't getting clobbered by 16. And the mayor last time won by 16. So we also cut 10 points off of his margin, or helped. I don't mean to say it was all us, but cut it to 6. So anytime you lose by 6 and go, gosh, we were just getting bludgeoned by 16, the first ballot they pressed, I think that's what happened there. And we could have had a Republican mayor of Green Bay.
Right, and I think I don't know if you heard that segment earlier this morning. I was talking about if only some of those that are so hyper focused on, Republicans fighting amongst themselves, if they were more focused on this particular race, and I know there was a lot of anger directed at, rightfully so, at Genrich, and how perhaps if they had channeled that anger against Genrich, they could have helped Chad Weininger over the finish line, and they'd have a Republican mayor. And the problem with Genrich would have gone away. They would have eliminated it, as opposed to being hyper-focused on, for whatever reason, their anger towards a fellow Republican Assembly leader, Speaker Robin Vos. So it's frustrating that we see this this pattern of behavior repeated. And I mean, this was the first time I'd seen a comparison side by side of how Chad Weininger received 5% more of the vote than Dan Kelly did in Green Bay. And as you said, imagine if he would have received just boy, I think it looks like, I don't know, about 1,500 votes separate the two candidates?
That's right.
Yeah.
That was it.
Yeah, it's frustrating. Well, John Pudner, thank you so much for joining me this morning. What's your website for our listeners to go out and check out your organization?
Sure, takebackaction.org. And Wisconsin is our largest chapter by far, so we really appreciate anyone joining and getting around the state a lot. So, yeah, takebackaction.org, and we'll let you know when we're coming to your county.
Well, good. I hope you will stay in touch.